By the mid-2010s, a supposedly more refined iteration of the horror genre had come to prominence and was attracting critical attention in more considered ways that had until then been reserved only for a handful of landmark pictures. While naming this variant as elevated, art, or post-horror has been criticised as elitist from fan bases and critics alike, it remains useful for demarcating a set of attributes distinct from the tropes of the wider genre. Art horror has come to be recognised as such for its allegiances to more art house sensibilities, its photography and symbolic visual language, its direction and mise-en-scène, and the way it often attracts established performers and experimental performances. Importantly though, it often employs an idiosyncratic sonic language across both sound and music too. Given these characteristics, the genre attracts, and was indeed born from, filmmakers whose own idiosyncratic sensibilities pushed them into auteur territory. Ari Aster, fast becoming known for his heavily atmospheric, tense, and often absurd or surreal creations across many genres, was responsible for writing and directing two of the most acclaimed art horrors, Hereditary and Midsommar. After writing multiple screenplays in his high school years and growing up on an encyclopedic diet of horror, his thesis film, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, epitomizes these traits and has become an internet folkloric meme of sorts in its own right. If you know, you know. Aster will often write to the music of an artist that eventually scores the film. It's a kind of pre-temp scoring process at the writing or conceptual stage rather than in the edit, but one that is still deeply influential on the tonal direction of the final film. His multi-film collaborator Bobby Kurlick of The Haxon Cloak had this honour for the writing of Midsommar, which he eventually scored, with well-received follow-up collaborations in Beau is Afraid and Eddington in Tow. But Hereditary, perhaps one of the defining horror films of this subgenre, and indeed this century so far, was scored by one-time collaborator, experimental multi-instrumentalist Colin Stetson, and in many ways Stetson proved the ideal counterpart to Aster's vision. By 2017, he was already an established solo artist. He'd released 7 studio albums and had numerous collaborations with 2000s Indian folk heavyweights like Arcade Fire and Bon Iver. Across his astonishing repertoire, he's known for his idiosyncratic playing style consisting of circular breathing, overblown harmonics, a virtuosic dexterity and complexity in an often post-minimal idiom played on bass and contrabass woodwind instruments. All this while also performing vocal melodies simultaneously using contact microphones on his vocal cords. These solo recordings largely scored Aster's writing process for Hereditary, and his 2017 piece, The Lure of the Mine, was notably used as temp score, and I have some idea where. Another of his signature techniques which makes this cue in particular so distinct is his percussive tapping of the saxophone keys, a conventionally undesirable artifact of the instrument to be masked, but now brought to the fore as a functional and meaningful extended technique. Alongside a contact-mic'd melody and a relentless 16th note bass and arpeggiated harmonic cycle, enabled by his circular breathing, the percussion adds yet another rhythmic layer to what is already an incredibly complex solo performance. Between the extremely low register of the contrabass instruments, the extreme high harmonics of their overblown extended techniques, and the rhythmic chatter of the keys, the music often takes on a deceptively electronic sonority. Horror films have long gravitated around the post-war classical modernist toolkit, aleatoric, clusters, microtonality, to attain these characteristics with the orchestra. So the introduction of more contemporary, electronically suggestive timbres into horror cinema, an old genre steeped in cliché and habit, can be effectively dissociating. This brings to mind the music of Sinister, whose electronic meanderings by Christopher Young, though punctuating some toy piano and music box clichés, were genuinely evocative. Alongside the film's beautifully curated set of unsettling experimental needle drops, it's evidence that these sonorities are now firmly in the toolbox of horror composers, elevated or otherwise. In Hereditary's opening, Stetson's ominous, pulsating bass drone accompanies the initial introduction to the characters across scenes, its oppressively persistent oscillation suggesting a ubiquitous presence in every corner of the home, and indeed in every corner of their lives. It's the same tone that precedes and foreshadows Charlie's anaphylaxis, solidifying an association between this sound and the inevitable pull of the demonic machinations at play. But is it the sheer uniqueness of Stetson's signature sonorities in the filmic context, the reapplication of more fundamental or structural musical features using these sonorities, or something else entirely, that lends them so well to accompany Hereditary's equally stark visual identity? As we know, Hereditary follows the story of a family in grief after the grandmother's death. Her daughter's troubled mourning, given their strained relationship, is interrupted by further calamity, and various presences within their home, and perhaps within themselves, begin to terrorize the vulnerable Grahams. This emotional and psychological vulnerability is explored through literal possession via a cult of demonic devotees, and the allegorical quality of that exploration goes some way to include the film within the elevated horror bracket with which A24 has become so closely associated. Indeed, Aster pitched Hereditary to A24 as primarily a family tragedy, whereby the family are subject to forces beyond their control. The film even gives us that frame, in hindsight, in Peter's classroom discussion of Heracles.
By the rule that the hero is undone by his fatal flaw, what is Heracles' flaw?
Arrogance?
Okay, so does that make it more tragic or less tragic than if he has a choice?
I think it's more tragic because if it's all just inevitable, then that means that the characters had no hope. They never had hope because they're all just like hopeless. They're all like pawns in this horrible, hopeless machine.
That idea of inevitability is central not only to the narrative but to the score. Aster has cited many influences on the writing of Hereditary: the grieving parents of Don't Look Now, the cultish conspiracy of Rosemary's Baby, the purging fire of Carrie. But it is because of, and sometimes in spite of, these landmark entries in the genre and the codes and tropes audiences are literate in, that Aster is able to subvert convention and exploit the audience's complacency that comes with that literacy. This dynamic becomes clear in Aster's films, in which artistic innovation and style are unburdened by considerations of ethics, by brutally betraying their narrative expectations. His choice of unique musical collaborator serves this subversion beautifully. But to know how both Aster and Stetson do this, we have to understand what they're subverting. The musical cliché of the devil's music being that of the fiddle is steeped in musical history. As a key instrument in 19th century peasant and often secular traditions and culture, it sat outside of those sanctioned by the church's spiritual authority. There's also, of course, the folkloric image of the virtuosic fiddler bargaining with the devil for unnatural or inhuman skill. The fiddle's often harsher tone than its orchestral counterpart in the violin may also go some way of solidifying this somewhat occult or supernatural association. This distinctive resonance is key to the effectiveness of the earthy, chilling, and ancient nature of Mark Corvin's score for The Witch. Here, the brittle sound of the Swedish nyckelharpa, a stopped fiddle dating back to the 14th century, has a sharpness in its resonance from both its bowing style and how the keys percuss and alter the resonance as they stop the strings. The additional unbowed resonance strings of the instrument provide a meditative or entrancing kind of drone quality, resonating out under and beyond the melodic line. In the bowed string context, it's a similar sonority to the hurdy-gurdy featured here again in The Witch, with its hand crank generating a seemingly infinite drone. This function or association of entrancement from the drone recurs across supernatural horror and is key to Hereditary's score too. On an acoustic level, the perception of sharpness or brightness in these sounds comes from the addition of more upper harmonic frequencies. For Stetson's woodwinds, however, these can be achieved through overblowing different types of reeds, and indeed the technological distortion of these reeded tones. There are numerous ancient wind instruments across cultures of the Middle East, the Levant and North Africa, such as the midjuiz, the yargul, and the zurna, whose double reeds help to provide these harsher sonorities, while the double pipes of the midjuiz and the yargul allow the player to play a drone or a pedal note at the same time. In combination with modes and scales unfamiliar to the average Western ear, these sonorities can be culturally legible as unsettling, alien, or even antagonistic to a broadly Western Christian sonic imagination. For example, in The Exorcist, one of the most influential horror horror films of all time, whose influences on Hereditary are numerous. From its very opening title, it uses Islam and Islamic adjacent music and culture as being inherently unchristian, and through its Orientalist coding, dangerously exotic, and therefore perhaps by extension demonic. The call to prayer, the cacophonous street sounds, and Jack Nietzsche's formless atmospheric soundscapes are married to visuals of the demon Pazuzu, while the unsettled priest feels more and more unwelcome. Good instincts. Stetson clearly uses the unsettling sonority of a wind instrument of this timbre from the opening cue. Whether or not it's derived from a zona-like instrument or a more conventional clarinet or oboe run through distortion effects for those higher harmonic frequencies, its contrasting harshness cuts through this incongruently undramatic tracking shot of these uncanny miniatures, projecting that unsettling, othering tone from the get-go. Along with the deep contrabass clarinet drones and layering of other woodwinds, indeed resembling Jack Nietzsche's archetypal atmospherics, they inject the very wood of the house and its surroundings with that ominousness. Stetson parts from the screeching strings and brass clusters commonly associated with more stereotypical horror scoring, effective though they can still be when wielded creatively. I was trying to avoid certain horror tropes and instrumentation usages that I feel are ubiquitous, and instead come up with ways to get those jobs done, suspension and tension, but not with the same instrumentation and timbres. Fellow A24 post-horror picture The Lighthouse made a similar departure in, again, Mark Corvin's score for its coastal and oceanic tone setting, where the wind's heavy drones mimic the ocean and its ship's foghorns. These choices, unsettling enough through their rejection of horror convention, is appropriate in another sense, matching a diegetic environmental component with a musical one. Given Hereditary's permeation by the visual and tactile textures of wood, from the panelling of the home, both life-sized and miniature, to Charlie's treehouse and forested surroundings, and indeed a certain carved lamppost, the earthy visual language is mimicked in the origins of the musical building blocks. The only real subtle exception to his non-melodic approach comes in the cue Steve, one of the score's few moments of relative melodic clarity. It begins with the brooding drones we're accustomed to, with this upward gradual pitch bend under Annie's desperate pleas. It's building our anticipation for whether or not Steve will believe her truth. A strong G in the bass sounds as his mind is made up, giving his decision weight.
It was you, wasn't it? What? All those nights you were pretending to go to the movies.
There's a minimal solo French horn motif in G minor as Annie's at her most vulnerable, pleading, believing her fate is sealed. The horn is mourning the end of their marriage, the end of her life. The clear natural minor tonality adds a jolt of humanity to these characters and their home, whose humanity has been completely displaced. Its atomized, solitary quality feels desperate, and Colette's performance makes it all the more heartbreaking. The pleas fall on deaf ears as Steve, dismayed by her mental state, rejects her explanations. The dominant D on the horn is joined by a drone of the same pitch, but their relative intonation wanders tensely. A crescendo builds, and it's Steve whose life this horn line is lamenting after all. Importantly, the woodwind and brass instruments across the score inherently require breath, and Stetson's playing and recording techniques do not seek to mask the sounds of inhalation and exhalation in favour of the pure tone of the instrument, but instead foreground them as a vital narrative aspect in the music. Aster does much the same. As Cattleman explores, Aster wisely foregrounds the sound of breathing as a vital part of the film's sound design, since breathing is a physical process that involuntarily animates the body, causing both physiological and psychological effects. Also, breathing is a repetitive, unending cycle for animate creatures, a concept that alludes to the perhaps repetitive, unending cycle in which the Graham family finds themselves trapped. Together, this pairing becomes interdiegetic and gives the music a hapticity which may otherwise be missing with those archetypal strings and brass alone. This kind of hapticity is distinct from the conventional bodily reactions to the jump scare, for example,
and achieves its dread despite its lingering slowness and ambiguity. It's this that helps place Hereditary in that post-horror bracket on its sonic level too, which so often rejects these tropes.
On inclusion in post-horror, Church states, "A monster is implied but never explicitly manifest. Because affect precedes emotion, creating diffuse sensations, the horror genre's affective impact cannot be simply reduced to abject imagery of the monster and its effects. This fits post-horror's lessened focus on the terror-inducing monster and its alternate focus on generating ambient states of dreadful unease."
The novel technological augmentations of Stetson's sonorities help to portray this dreadful unease, to project a requisite obscurity or unfamiliarity of the sound's origin, telling the audience that the familiar or the safe is being undone, and that the method of that undoing is in itself alien or demonic
or unknowable. Kelly describes Stetson's music in this context as embodied uncertainty. Stetson's warm and sinister timbres enact an embodied uncertainty not only in the disparity between the opening's innocuous image and ominous sound, but also because of the ever-present instability in defining the timbral qualities themselves. The wood of the instruments is augmented, the wood of the home is possessed.
Part of this embodied uncertainty comes from the disembodied voice.
You know what she did?
It's used profusely across horror. It's inhuman vocal manipulation, perverting the personhood or humanity of the possessed, or indeed showcasing the unearthly power of the unknown spectre.
Wake up.
Stetson's opening cue features a disembodied voice, which may be his contact mic picking up obscured speech. The demonically treated spoken vocals, in conjunction with the miniatures that morph into what we assume is the real home, suggest a liminal space outside of or beyond a shared reality. Annie's psychological distress, family history of schizophrenia, and her need for control in her orchestration of these miniatures gives the audience a potentially rationalist view of an inner world she is creating rather than these being objective events. The choice to use Annie's career as a miniature artist could be a way for Aster to subtly express that what the audience is about to watch is purely an expression of Annie's unconscious and her reaction to the disastrous events that will follow, and may not in fact be a reality within the narrative. On this being a trope of the post-horror subgenre, Church states, "In classic art cinema style, these films predominantly filtered their diegetic visions through the vagaries of characters' distressed psychological states, often refusing to confirm or deny the truth of their seemingly supernatural happenings. Hence, if these films evoke a deep sense of unease, it is partly because they often retain one foot in the realm of real-world plausibility."
2022's Skinamarink masterfully used the disembodied voice in the context of the liminal space, a cornerstone of its analog horror subgenre. Indeed, a certain rationalist reading of that film also is that it's a series of hallucinations from the perspective of one of the trapped children after suffering some kind of brain injury, an internal liminal space of sorts. These associations with analog horror are efficient to project this unknown sonic identity, particularly through the idea of capturing these paranormal phenomena through the corrupting effects of aging physical media. While Hereditary's aesthetic qualities are the antithesis of analog horror, sound editor Lewis Goldstein was still able to put some destructive artifacts to creative use in the sound mix for Hereditary.
We decided to purposefully noise reduce the dialogue in the dream sequence scene to such a point that there was digital artifacting.
What's going on? You were sleepwalking.
And that actually worked to our benefit. It adds a character to the sound that we very specifically wanted to have the characters be in this vacuum while they're arguing.
I'm sorry. Is Charlie here?
The dissociative effect of the disembodied voice again worked amazingly well in the soundtrack placement of Ulva's Silence Teaches Us How to Sing in Sinister. There it provided a literally haunting, unnaturally repeated, unintelligible refrain as Ethan Hawke's Ellison Oswald, so enraptured by the found film's hypnotic violence and the indifference of its juvenile perpetrators, seems to enter the space with the victims as we see his POV of the projected Super 8 films.
This nonchalance and indifference to extreme violence, or indeed the celebration of it, is narratively one of the most chilling aspects of so many horror films. Hereditary and Midsommar both share a jubilance in the triumph of evil over good from the warped perspective of the cult, but this extreme schadenfreude of sorts has its origins in the classics which influenced them.
In The Wicker Man,
Not that one.
we see the ultimate example of this jubilation. The film's score is exclusively whimsical folk music and arrangements of early secular folk songs, effectively Celtic in origin, played on harps, accordions, zithers, and acoustic guitar. Alongside images of the ruined church and the hippie-era nudity, it places the islanders' pagan religion in contention with the Christian mainlander. While not satanic specifically, their rituals and ultimate sacrifice of the foreigner are all the more chilling, for not only is the musical accompaniment so sonically joyful, but its cultural framework is largely indifferent to the entire Christ-Antichrist dichotomy, and whatever sense-making this moral, cultural context allows us to form, and indeed for them to ignore. The victorious cultists in Rosemary's Baby as well, successfully birthing the Antichrist, are accompanied by a sharp, devilish sonority of its own.
What have you done to it?
It's brass in origin, likely a trumpet, and not digitally augmented, but muted and performed in an unruly and chaotic way, almost a yodel, a sneering, cruel laughter. The surrounding cries of "Hail Satan" with this sonority
Hail Satan! Hail Satan!
would be deeply familiar to any fan of Hereditary's finale. The aptly titled Reborn perversely accompanies the cult's jubilation for the rebirth of Payman. After years of their toiling and plotting, their anti-savior is finally actualized. This cue is frequently compared to Schubert's Ave Maria. In fact, its anempathetic power was wonderfully analyzed by Charles Cornell. He speaks of how the shared upward movement of arpeggios in such a firmly major mode becomes an exultant celebration, tracing an upwards ascendancy. The cue beautifully sets this rejoicing tone as we are firmly in the perspective of the cult. Ave Maria, in its reverence of Mary, now has a perversely jubilant inversion in the reverence of Queen Lee, whose efforts have finally come to fruition. However, the cue also bears a striking resemblance to Wagner's Das Rheingold prelude. The prelude's own upward movement of arpeggios this time represent a naturalistic description of the mythical creatures springing to life in the depths of the Rhine River. But unlike Ave Maria's harmonic movement, the prelude's E-flat major drone and unchanging harmony for minutes on end make it a relatively minimalistic sonic painting of sorts, as Stetson's cue very much also is. It's somewhat poetic too that in the prelude, the Rheingold is illuminated by a ray of sunlight, and the nymphs responsible for its guarding explain that the gold can be made into a magic ring, which gives power to rule the world. But Ave Maria has another claim to influence. There's a brief allusion to a descending chromatic line which is shared by both Ave Maria and Reborn. It sounds like it could be sung by Stetson, picked up by his contact mic, then dying out, perhaps signifying the last dying vestige of any goodness falling away at the feet of this triumphant evil. In amongst the ironic, almost majestic top line of punishing, distorted and evil winds and synths, brass instrument, lightly muted, replicates the chaotic, sneering laughter of the Rosemary's Baby reveal. The relentless low drone in bass voices acts as a chorus for the devil.
This irony-laden piece would be a rare and unconventional approach for 20th century scoring. Possession-oriented scores like Goldsmith's The Omen borrowed the textual and instrumental evocations of church music with the choir and the organ to forge an almost operatic melodrama. And in doing so, to describe the victory of evil over good from the narrative perspective that this triumph is a tragedy. Stetson's centering of the cultist's joy is what truly unsettles. So powerful is this perspective, in fact, set somewhat of a musical trend for the musical accompaniment of these kinds of endings across numerous horror pictures since. The jubilation they feel and we hear is mimicked at the end of Aster's follow-up, Midsummer, with a score by Bobby Krilic, as the victorious cultist's successful indoctrination of Dani as the May Queen shows us another perversion of the irrational outsider being sublimated into the cult's barbaric rituals.
We hear another form of this major jubilation and another vengeful ritual sacrifice of the morally reprehensible restaurant patrons being once again purged by fire and getting their just desserts.
While Hereditary's avoidance of horror musical cliché served the picture's requirement for sonic idiosyncrasy, the score also taps into a much older archetype, Stetson as the uncanny virtuoso literally breathing new evil life into these characters. He perfectly realized Aster's brief to create truly evil music, imbuing the film with Payman's unique wickedness through equally unique musical choices. Those choices also helped consolidate a newer sonic vocabulary audiences can recognize and later composers can utilize. Despite all of Aster's auteurist visual and narrative strengths, Stetson's score bears equal responsibility for the film's lingering impact on both us as an audience and indeed the characters he helped possess. So thank you so much for watching episode 11. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe. As always, drop a message on what film you'd like to see me cover next and what scores you'd like to hear me recreate. I'll try my best to do a recreation of a cue from Hereditary, but given Stetson's completely live, solo, multi-layered, very much performed rather than sequenced style of composing and performing, it might be a bit more of a tricky one. So I'll give it a shot, but if not, there will be some other MIDI mockups dropping very shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.